Hello and welcome to the Cloud Gaming Report. I'm Zach, and in this week we have a little bit lighter of a news load, but that's not necessarily a bad thing simply because the last 2 weeks have been very news heavy, so it's nice to have a little bit of a lighter load every once in a while. So just a couple of teasers before we get started today. Shadow has launched a Linux app, and Josh over at Flixstick has devised a way to have the very early experience of cloud-based VR. So some very cool things to talk about, even though it has been a rather light news week. So to begin, I wanted to discuss the new games that have been added as supported games on the GeForce Now platform. On 6.4, they added Hitman, and on 6.5, they added The Darkness 2 and Vampire. Moving on, we have a very interesting interview on Variety with the Ubisoft CEO, and he talks about the future of consoles and how cloud gaming will be a huge player in the future of gaming in general. So a direct quote that I wanted to share with you guys is, begin quote, "There will be one more console generation, and then after that, we will be streaming, all of us," end quote. So there's a lot of conviction in his statement from a very large player in the world of gaming. Ubisoft makes a ton of games. They are a very large publisher of games. I definitely don't like their PC app, but all being said, they are still a huge player in the world of gaming and definitely in AAA games. They're definitely one of the larger publishers out there. So with all that being said, I could definitely see the next generation of consoles being the last, at least with looking at consoles the way we do now as dedicated hardware with higher end components. And I can definitely see the future being cloud gaming. There are some very strong contenders out there in terms of software, and why I'm saying software is because there are some outside factors that are going to prevent cloud gaming from going truly mainstream, and I'll get to those in a bit. But the software is definitely there for services like Shadow, Parsec, and GeForce Now. GeForce Now offers a very simple way to get into cloud gaming. They actually cache a lot of the data for a lot of games on Steam, and essentially the install process is nearly instant. You do always have the kind of preliminary stuff you have to do with Steam. It runs through 2 to 3 steps. So in 1 to 2 minutes, even though you might not have had the game installed, you could be up and playing a game on the GeForce Now platform, and it offers a very simple UI to get into those games and start playing. It does have some restrictions though, so that's where a service like Parsec or Shadow could come into play, simply because they give you more unrestricted access to the cloud hardware. So if you want to install additional applications such as OBS and stream straight from the cloud, or if you want to install Fraps and benchmark the games that you're playing in the cloud, there are some very strong options out there. And I could definitely see, the most hardcore people continuing to stick around with local hardware, simply because there are some use cases that still benefit from having a high-end local device. But in 4 to 5 years, that could very well change too. For example, video editing, I haven't had the best experience on the cloud, but it's getting closer. The biggest thing there is the speed of the hard drive. Some of the services have slower storage speeds. So if you're trying to scrub through a video, sometimes that's not as good as experience as if you had a local machine with an SSD or a high-speed connection to your network server. So there are some barriers still in the way though for cloud gaming to go truly mainstream, and I view those as two separate things. The first of which is your proximity to the cloud data centers. For example, Shadow is currently only on the West Coast. So if you're on the East Coast, you're not going to have a great experience connecting to Shadow. There have been people that have done it and had a decent enough experience, but it's not going to be the best experience you could possibly have. I'm in the Midwest, so I'm pretty much in the center of the US, and I've connected to data centers both on the East and West Coast because very few people actually implement servers in the Midwest or very close to me. So I'm usually stuck with going somewhere on the West Coast or somewhere on the East Coast, and I've had very good experiences with that despite the distance. But as these services continue to mature, I expect to see more and more data centers continue to roll out. For example, in the US, GeForce Now has probably 6 or 7. There's quite a few data centers just in the US alone, and they're spaced out so to minimize your distance to the data center, which is definitely what you want for cloud gaming or even other software out there, such as like if you're trying to do video editing, you want to minimize your latency and your proximity to the data center. So a lot of stuff is still kind of, there are some barriers in the way, like I was talking about, and your proximity to the server is one of those, but it's the minor of the two, because I have had very good experiences with a data center halfway across the US. The biggest barrier is going to be our internet infrastructure, and this is just going off my experience in the US. It's likely different in other areas of the world, but if you live in a smaller town, or if you live out in the country, if you're in a rural area in general, you probably don't have a good internet connection, and that is going to be the biggest barrier for cloud gaming going truly mainstream. I've lived in areas that have AT&T DSL and CenturyLink DSL, and the worst connection of which was for $50 per month roughly. I had a 10 megabit downstream, which is crazy to think about, because in other areas you could have Google Fiber, which I believe if you get the package without the TV is $70 per month. So for only $20 per month, you have a massively better connection. And it's kind of like mind-blowing to think about it that way, like how overcharged people in rural areas are. But we're on the verge of 5G being widely implemented in the next couple years. So when that happens, I think that could definitely be a game changer, depending on if it lives up to its hype to even a fraction, if it's only as half as good as people are expecting it to be, and the greed of the mobile broadband ISPs, if they continue the trend of offering unlimited data, and unlimited is definitely in quotes, because it's only unlimited for a set amount of data. I think that's 15 gigabytes for most platforms. At least it is with Verizon if you're using your device as a hotspot, and the phone itself or the tablet itself can utilize like 22 gigabytes before the connection is slowed down to like 600 kilobits per second. And that's just on Verizon. It could change from platform to platform. But with 5G, you're going to be able to access data so much faster. If you're streaming at, for example, 30 megabits per second on your mobile broadband connection, you're going to fly through data. So hopefully the broadband providers, the mobile broadband providers such as AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, all those, and of course that's going to change depending on where you're physically located in the world. If you're in Canada, they have different providers. But hopefully those guys get less greedy and more open to increasing your quote unquote data cap, even though it's technically not there. It's technically unlimited, just not at full speed. So 5G has the possibility of truly revolutionizing how we play games, and could very well make cloud gaming a true possibility. And with the time frame we're looking at, with one more generation of dedicated hardware that should last at least 3 to 4 years before it starts to get outdated, or too outdated in relation to console generations, then we could very well see a lot happen in the world with better internet infrastructure, these cloud gaming services maturing and having more and more data centers spread out, so you have less latency simply due to physical distance. So all in all, I definitely see the timeline of the Ubisoft CEO being spot on, and in 4 to 5 years, I could definitely see cloud gaming being the default way that people play games. All right, so moving on to our shadow news, we have word now that the Linux app is now available. It is still only in beta, and I don't have a lot to talk about here simply because I haven't had the chance to test this yet. But my cat just jumped up on the desk, so sorry guys. But anyways, I don't have a lot to talk about here simply because I haven't had a chance to test this yet, but I will be installing Linux on an older laptop, or I might be getting another one of the Asus tablets that I have, or Asus 2-in-1s that I have, so I can test the cloud gaming experience from the Linux perspective. So keep an eye out on that. But it is definitely exciting news for people that prefer Linux as their primary OS of choice. So moving on, we have our final article, and that is a very interesting and thought-provoking piece from Josh over at Flickstick about the future of cloud gaming and how that could possibly involve VR. So Josh has actually tested VR cloud gaming, and there are a lot of hoops to go through, so this definitely isn't for the faint of heart, but he actually has the setup working. So there are limitations, as he details in this blog post. There are actually like 5 or 6 blog posts that follow up that walk you through the entire process of getting this to work. And like I said, it is a decently lengthy process and are some hoops to jump through, and there are some limitations. So do keep all that in mind, but this is the very early stages of seeing how cloud gaming could actually impact more than just standard gaming, but also VR. And this is particularly interesting because VR is so computationally intense. There aren't a lot of games that have a super high fidelity experience that are more low polygon. A lot of games are simply to ensure a high frame rate experience, because if you have a lower frame rate experience, your actions won't line up to what you're doing in the real world, and this is jarring and is definitely very noticeable. It's more noticeable than other aspects of VR. Some of the things of VR that aren't as advanced as we'd like them to be. The biggest thing that really comes up is if your actions aren't completely in sync. And that does mean there are a lot of challenges though for VR cloud gaming, where you would have to have a very, very low latency connection to your data center to actually ensure that your frames were 100% in sync to your real world actions. Most people recommend having games play anywhere from 90 to 120 FPS to ensure a very playable and enjoyable experience. So with that being said, that means you would need anywhere from like a 5 millisecond ping roughly to 8 or so millisecond ping to actually have your frames completely in sync to what you're doing in the game world. Because with a 60 FPS experience, you only have 11 milliseconds for latency to actually transmit your actions to the cloud and back to you to actually have your frames 100% in sync. But with a mouse, if your frames are a couple frames behind, it's not game breaker. But in the VR world, since you're actually swinging a motion controlled or motion tracked controller, it's a little bit different because you're actually physically swinging that in the real world, and your brain is expecting whatever you're seeing to actually follow those actions. So there are some limitations and there are some concerns, but this is very cool to see the ground stages of VR cloud gaming. So the final thing that I wanted to share with you guys is I am running a giveaway over on gleam.io. I will share the link to all these topics as well as this giveaway in the description below or in the podcast description, depending on whatever application you're using to listen to this podcast, or if you're watching this on YouTube. So there are several ways you can enter. If you just follow me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, so on and so forth, you can get some entries. There aren't a ton of entries right now, so you have a pretty good chance of winning Assassin's Creed Origins. So good luck to everybody that does enter. So thanks for watching or listening to this week's episode of the Cloud Gaming Report. If you did like it, give it a like, a follow, a subscribe, a heart, whatever the action is to show your support on your podcast app of choice, whether that be a dedicated podcast app or just watching on YouTube. I do greatly appreciate all the support that you guys give to the Cloud Gaming Report, myself personally, as well as Stop Provoking Tech as a whole. I do greatly appreciate that, guys. I just wanted to make sure that you guys knew that. If you are someone in the community or possibly even work for one of these providers out there and want to share some thoughts on cloud gaming and want to possibly co-host an episode on either just a one-off or possibly even a recurring basis, do reach out to me. My Twitter and all that information, my email and all that should be listed on the podcast, as long as everything that I have filled out on the podcast is working. Or if you're watching on YouTube, just hit me up in the comments if you are interested in possibly co-hosting an episode of the Cloud Gaming Report in the future. So once again, guys, thanks for watching, and until next time, Zach out.